right, ladies and gentlemen, let's get ready to roll tonight. Welcome out if you're in person or if you're online out in Cyberland. Hello. My name is Shawn Kasten, and I will be your guest speaker, leader, everything tonight because everybody's on vacation except for me, so I'm here. All right, so first we're going to open up in prayer. So join with me as we go to God in prayer. Heavenly Father, thanks for this day and the chance to come together and, Lord, to worship you, to learn about you, and, Lord, help us to learn how to get closer to you. God, be with us, be with me as I speak, and help it to be your words, not mine. And be with everyone who hears them, Lord, and help them to take it and put it into application in their lives. In your heavenly name I pray. Amen. All right, so we're going to do something a little weird tonight. I want everybody, if you're able, to stand up. We're going to get a little more interactive, and we're going to slowly work back into this. Okay, everybody's up? All right. Now what I want you to do is turn around to the person closest to you and say, "Hi, how are you?" All right, and if you're joining us online, then turn to your whoever's on the couch with you or wherever and say hi to them, or send somebody a text message and say, "Hey, how are you?" But then come right back here. So, okay, everybody good? Yeah. All right, have a seat. All right, I just like to get that blood flowing and get moving, get active and stuff. So tonight, I'm going to be talking to you guys, and it's something that's kind of been working the last 2 or 3 months. I've been kind of pulling this together. And it all started one day when we took Annalise to the park in this little playground. And she's back there going, "Oh, Dad." So we took her to the park. And this park has these big tunnels that you can climb up into the tunnel and climb down and move around and all kinds of stuff. And she was scared to death of these tunnels. So I was there. I was like, "Now, Annalise, you can do this." But she was afraid because there were other kids, and the other kids could do it. They could just run up there. They could play, swing, hang from the monkey bars, do all kinds of stuff that their parents just probably wish they didn't do. But they could do it because they were a little bit older, and they were a little bit more experienced. Some of them were a little taller, too. But she wanted to do it, and she was old enough. She could do it. So we get her climbing up this tunnel thing, and it's just not working. She's struggling. She's getting upset. We're getting upset. So we're like, okay, how are we going to do this? So I go to the top of the tunnel, and Missy's down at the bottom, and I'm standing up there going, "Come on, Annalise, you can do it." And I put my hands out. And I'm reaching my hands out to her, and I can see that look in her eyes. When she looks up at me, she's like, "I can do this." And then she falls down on her butt again. So after about 3 or 4, man, she is back there red as a pumpkin. Or red as a pumpkin? Where'd that come from? Red as an apple. All right. So she falls back down. But she gets up, and she tries one more time. And she climbs up to the top, and she's just about to grab a hold of me. And I look at her, and I say, "Look at me. Don't look anywhere else. Look at me." And she did. She looked straight in my eyes. She didn't even worry about her hand, but as she was looking at me, she grabbed my hand, and I helped her on up. And that was the happiest day in the world because now she could do it. She could do it with no problems. So we could go over and sit on the bench and let her get all hot and sweaty, and we didn't have to. But it was good because she overcame her fear. She overcame the thing that she wanted but was so afraid of. But she had seen other kids doing it, and she wanted to do it because the other kids had done it. So she was asking, she's like, "Dad, we've got to do this. We can do this. Let's go do it." So I'm like, "Okay, let's go do this." And I learned something that day. And I was sitting there and I was like, what difference does it make if she knew that I was at the top, and I was encouraging her to come up to me. What difference did that make? And I think it made all the difference in the world. You have a question? No. Oh. It makes a big difference. Okay. All right. So me being up there calling to her and supporting her, that made all the difference in the world. So I gave her that extra little ability that she didn't think that she had. And tonight, we're going to look at a couple stories where the most powerful thing or the most worthy thing is not necessarily what God uses. And we're going to try to figure out how that relates to our lives. So if you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, turn to Numbers chapter 13. We don't usually talk about the book of Numbers. It's kind of early on in the Bible. It's about right there. Page 149, if you happen to have the same Bible I do, which you probably don't. But anyway. All right, so Numbers chapter 13, verse 30. So the Israelites have been promised the promised land. God has told them, you're going to have this land. All you have to do is go take it. So we pick up the story in verse 30. Then Caleb quieted the people in the presence of Moses and said, let's go up now and take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it. Verse 31. But the men who had gone up with him responded, we can't attack the people because they are stronger than we are. So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land they had scouted. The land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants, and all the people we saw in it are men of great size. We even saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. To ourselves, we seemed like grasshoppers, and we must have seen the same to them. So in this story, these two scouts, they're sent to see what is in the promised land. And they go and they see all kinds of milk and honey and great things, all kinds of fruit. But they also see these giants in the land. So two of them come back and say, oh, no problem. God's with us. We've got this. No problem. But the rest of them come back and say, ain't going to touch this one with a 10-foot pole. All right, so they go on, and the two of them continue on. They keep reassuring them that we've got this. God is with us. We can do this. And in verse 9, it says, their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Don't be afraid of them. I can see them up there, just like me looking down to Annalise, saying, you can do it. We can do it because God is with us. You know, I'm telling her that Daddy's here. Daddy can do this. Daddy can help you. Daddy can do anything, yeah. So they're encouraging them. They're leading them and saying, we've got this because God is on our side. So that's the backstory. And now we're going to turn to 1 Samuel. It's just a couple books to the right. Still in the Old Testament. Originally, the books of 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, and 2 Kings were all one big book. And then they broke it up into 2 books. And then they broke it up into 4 books. We're going to start in chapter 2 of 1 Samuel. And this is a pretty well-known story. It's Hannah's prayer. Okay, and we're going to see how this ties in here in just a second. Chapter 2, verse 1 of 1 Samuel. Hannah prayed, my heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is lifted up by the Lord. My mouth boasts over my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. And there is no rock like our God. Do not boast so proudly, or let arrogant words come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and actions are weighed by him. The bows of the warriors are broken, but the feeble are clothed with strength. Those who full hire themselves out for food, but those who are starving hunger no more. The woman who is childless gives birth to 7, but the woman with many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and gives life. He sends some down to Sheol, and he raises others up. The Lord brings poverty and gives wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the trash heap. He seats them with noblemen and gives them a throne of honor. For the foundation of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world on them. And here's our key verse, verse 9. He guards the steps of his faithful ones, but the wicked perish in darkness. For a person does not prevail by his own strength. In verse 10, those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder in the heavens against them. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give power to his king. He will lift up the horn of his anointed. So Hannah, and there's a long story that goes into this, and I'm trying to sum it up into like 30 seconds is a huge task. So Hannah is praying for a child. And when she prays for this child, she says that she's going to give this child to the Lord. And so God gives her the child. He goes to work in the temple, and he eventually becomes the first judge, or the last judge. So now we're going to turn over to chapter 8, verse 1. Again, just a couple more pages to the right. So, God's people have taken the land. They've come in. Man, my English teacher would be so mad at me. They've came into the land. They've taken possession of it. Okay? And now, here we are in verse 8. Or chapter 8, verse 1. And Samuel was Hannah's child. Okay, so that's how the story connects here. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. His firstborn son's name was Joel, and his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. However, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned toward dishonest profit. They took bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us the same as all the other nations have." When they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand wrong, so he prayed to the Lord. But the Lord told him, "Listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king. They are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me, since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. Listen to them, but solemnly warn them and tell them about the customary rights of the king who will reign over them." So the people, they followed God all the way into the promised land. They've taken the promised land. But then they see that the sons of Samuel aren't leading the way that they're supposed to be. And this really, it doesn't really affect them, but they're using it as an excuse. They say, "You're not doing your job. Your sons are not doing their job. So we want a king." And the reason they wanted a king is because every other nation around them had a king. Just like Annalise wanted to get up to the top of that tunnel thing because all of the other kids were able to do it. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but the reason they wanted a king was their fault, because they didn't trust God. They said, "We want a king." Even back when Moses first came around, they were listening to God. And then Moses came, and they started branching away. And then Joshua, they kept branching away. And now they wanted a king. So they want a human person to judge over them. If you turn over to chapter 10, verse 17, chapter 10, 17. So Samuel agrees. He finally agrees. In verse 17, it says, Samuel summoned the people to the Lord at Mizpah and said to the Israelites, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought Israel out of Egypt, and I rescued you from the power of the Egyptians and all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But today you have rejected your God, who saves you from all your troubles and afflictions. You said to him, you must set a king over us. Okay, so he's basically saying, you asked for this. Now, let's see what comes of it. So we turn to 1 Samuel 15. We're getting a workout today. 1 Samuel 15, starting in verse 10. So God appointed Saul as the king, the first king. Verse 10. Then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. Did I skip something? I did. Okay, so they made Saul king. Okay, we skipped over that. So Saul's king, he's ruling. And then in 15:10 it says, then the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from following me and has not carried out my instructions. So Samuel became angry and cried out to the Lord all night. Early in the morning, Samuel got up to confront Saul, but it was reported to Samuel, Saul went to Carmel, where he set up a monument to himself. Then he turned around and went down to Gilgal. When Samuel came to him, Saul said, may the Lord bless you. I have carried out the Lord's instructions. Samuel replied, then what is this sound of sheep, goats, and cattle I hear? Saul answered, the troops brought them from the Amalekites and spared the best sheep, goats, and cattle in order to offer a sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest were destroyed. Now, he was told to wipe out the Amalekites and all of their possessions. Verse 16, stop, exclaimed Samuel. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Tell me, he replied. Samuel continued, although you once considered yourself unimportant, have you not become the leader of the tribes of Israel? The Lord anointed you king over Israel, and then sent you on a mission and said, go and completely destroy the sinful Amalekites. Fight against them until you have annihilated them. So why didn't you obey the Lord? Why did you rush on the plunder and do what was evil in the Lord's sight? Okay, so Saul became king. Saul lost it. He started worshiping himself. He made a statue to himself. He took the best things that the Amalekites had and he kept them for himself. He was not ruling the way that God wanted him to. And then he goes on, verse 20. But I did obey the Lord, Saul answered. I went on the mission the Lord gave me. I brought back King Agag of Amalek, and I completely destroyed the Amalekites. The troops took sheep, goats, and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was set apart for destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. Okay, so he's justifying himself. He's like, but I brought these for God. Then Samuel said, does the Lord take pleasure in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the Lord? Look, to obey is better than sacrifice. To pay attention is better than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination or spell casting, and defiance is like wickedness and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. So here we have the people taking the land, getting all set up. God has prepared their way. They get there 400 years later. They say, we want a king. God gives them a king. So they're starting to veer away. So there's the world and God. And then the king does exactly the same thing. He veers away again from God. So God gives Samuel another mission. He tells him to go and anoint the next king. But Samuel's scared. He's scared because if the current king finds out that Samuel is going to anoint a new king, he's going to kill him. He's going to be dead. D-I-E-A-D, dead. Yeah. All right, so chapter 16, verse 5. In peace, he replied, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. So he's kind of going under a undercover act here. He says, I've come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourself and come with me to sacrifice. Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they arrived, Samuel saw Eliab and said, certainly the Lord's anointed one is here before me. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or his stature, because I have rejected him. Humans do not see what the Lord sees, for humans see what is visible, but the Lord sees the heart. Okay, so he goes on through all of these sons, these 7 sons of, what's his name, Jesse. He goes through each one of them, and he's like, oh, these are some good-looking guys. They'd make a perfect king. Now remember, and I don't know if I said this or not. If not, I should have. But Saul was a good head taller than anybody else. So he was a big guy, period. And he was good looking. He was a kingly kind of guy. And then each one of these guys is very kingly. We'll find out later that they're in the military. So they're government quality. So he goes through all of these different people. And he's like, none of these 7 are the Lord's anointed. So he says, you sure you don't have any other kids? And this is why I really like this message on Father's Day, because this is like the perfect non-Father's Day example. The guy's like, well, there is this one other kid. I think he's off somewhere in the fields. You know, he doesn't come across as the perfect father to me. But anyway. So he says, yeah, there is this other kid. Let's go get him. He's out with the sheep. And so in verse 30, it says, so Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on David from that day forward. And then Samuel went back to Ramah. Okay, so again, we've got this big long story of they came into the land, they took possession of the land, and then 400 years, 400, 500, I forget, one of those two, they decide we want a king. So God gives them a king, the king works for a little bit, and then it totally goes off track. So then God says, we're going to need another plan. So God says, we're going to put a king that is going to follow my word, my law. So, what time is it now? 6:30. Okay, good. We're getting to the part where I need to be. It always takes so much time to catch up to where I need to be. All right, so we are in chapter 17 of 1 Samuel. And I guarantee you that almost everybody in this room, I know everybody in this room, but everybody in the United States has at some point heard this story or some version of this story. Okay, it's the classic underdog story. We've got David, the little guy, and Goliath, the big guy. Okay? Well, you know me, I don't like to go with the normal mainstream, so you're going to love me. Okay? I don't think this story is about David at all. David could have been anybody. This is God versus Goliath. Okay? So if you want to take your Bible and just kind of cross out David and put God versus Goliath, because that's what it is. It's God standing up at the top of the tunnel calling for his children. Okay? Now this is like the 7th inning stretch here, okay? So stretch out a little bit. We're going to jump into this reading. David versus Goliath. The Philistines gathered their forces for war at Soka in Judah, and camped between Soka and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. Saul and the men of Israel gathered and camped in the valley of Elah. Then they lined up in battle formation to face the Philistines. Okay, so everybody is clear. We got a mountain here, a mountain here, and a valley in between. Okay, we got the good guys and the bad guys. All right. The Philistines were standing on a hill, and the Israelites were on another hill with a ravine in between them. Then a champion. Okay, and we're going to focus on this word champion. A champion means somebody who goes between. Okay, so they decide my champion is going to be Goliath. Okay, and we'll come back to it later. A champion named Goliath from Gath came out from the Philistine camp. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall. Okay, so that's all it ever says about how tall he was or how big he was. He was 9 feet 9 inches tall. So that's pretty big because they were generally shorter then. Okay, he was 9 feet 9 inches tall. And then it goes on to give like 5 verses describing his armor. Okay? He wore a bronze helmet, a bronze scale armor that weighed 125 pounds. This is like probably twice as much as David weighed. There was bronze armor on his shins, and a bronze javelin was slung between his shoulders, so it was carried on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's beam, and the iron point of his spear weighed 15 pounds. In addition, a shield bearer was walking in front of him. So you've got this tank of a guy with long-range weaponry, and then you've got a guy walking in front of him with a giant shield. Wouldn't you hate to be that guy? Okay, so this is like the perfect battle machine. He stood and shouted to the Israelite battle formations. "Why do you come out to line up in battle formation?" he asked them. "Am I not a Philistine, and are you not servants of Saul? Choose one of your men and have him come down against me." Now this is a challenge. He is straight up calling Saul out. He's saying, "Aren't you the army of Saul? The one who's supposed to fight the battles for you? The one that you asked for a long time ago? He's your king, right? Choose one of your men and have him come down against me. If he wins in a fight against me and kills me, we will be your servants. But if I win against him and kill him, then you will be our servants and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "I defy the ranks of Israel today. Send me a man so we can fight each other." When Saul and all Israel heard these words from the Philistine, they lost their courage and were terrified. Saul is the king. He is the one that's supposed to know what to do. And he's terrified. I mean, I probably would be too, because there's a big dude down there with armor and yeah. Okay, we're going to skip down to verse 16. Every morning and evening for 40 days, the Philistine came forward and took his stand. One day, Jesse had told his son David, "Take this half bushel of roasted grain along with these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp." So Jesse was there when David was anointed as king, but he's like still not the best father at this point. He's saying, take this out there and go feed your brothers because they're more important than you are. Also, take these 10 portions of cheese to your field commanders because they're special. They get cheese. I hope it's mozzarella. I love mozzarella. Check on the well-being of your brothers and bring a confirmation from them. Basically, he's saying, are they still alive? They are with Saul and all the men of Israel in the valley of Elah, fighting with the Philistines. So David got up early in the morning, left the flock with someone to keep it, loaded up, and set out as Jesse had charged him. He arrived at the perimeter of the camp as the army was marching out to its battle formation, shouting their battle cry. Israel and the Philistines lined up in the battle formation facing each other. So notice we're seeing a mirror image here. We see the Philistines lined up for battle. We see the Israelites line up for battle. They're starting to become like the Philistines. David left his supplies in the care of the quartermaster and ran to the battle line. He ran to the battle line. When he arrived, he asked his brothers how they were. While he was speaking with them, suddenly the champion named Goliath, the Philistine from Gath, came forward from the Philistine battle line and shouted his usual words, which David heard. When all the Israelite men saw Goliath, they retreated from him terrified. Now remember, this has been going on for 40 days. They still keep coming up and lining up, but then as soon as they see he's there, they retreat. They're terrified. Okay, and then there's this whole bunch of other bit that we'll skip. They keep repeating. Basically, the king says, whoever kills Goliath is going to get lots of money, they're not going to have to pay taxes, and they also get to marry my daughter. Okay, so they repeat that a couple times. And David hears this, he finds out, and he's bound and determined that he's going to do it. What David said was overheard and reported to Saul. So he had David brought to him. David said to Saul, "Don't let anyone be discouraged by him. Your servant will go and fight this Philistine." Doesn't that sound a lot like what Caleb and Joshua said? They said, "Don't worry about it. We've got this. God is with us." But Saul replied, "You can't go fight this Philistine. You're just a youth, and he's been a warrior since he was young." Saul had no spiritual inkling at this point. He was totally relying on the world, on himself. David answered Saul, "Your servant has been tending his father's sheep. Whenever a lion or a bear came and carried off a lamb from the flock, I went after it, struck it down, and rescued the lamb from its mouth. If it reared up against me, I would grab it by its fur, strike it down, and kill it. Your servant has killed lions and bears. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defiled the armies of the living God." There is the key. It's no longer about the Philistines versus the Israelites. It's the Philistines versus God. Because they defiled, they blasphemed, they brought up something against God. They're almost denying. They're denying that God is powerful, that God is who he says he is. Okay, your servant has killed, we did that already. Yeah. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defiled the armies of the living God. Then David said, "The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine." So Saul says to David, "Go, and may the Lord be with you." It kind of, when I read that, I say, maybe there's a little bit of hope left for Saul. Or maybe it took a little kid telling Saul that he needs to suck it up and be the champion that he needs to be, because he's the king. And David is willing to go fight this guy when the king wouldn't go do it. With the entire army, none of them would go do it. So then Saul takes his own military clothes and armor, and he puts it on David. He puts a bronze helmet on David's head and had him put on armor. David strapped a sword on over the military clothes and tried to walk, but he was not used to them. "I can't walk in these," David said to Saul. "I'm not used to them." So David took them off. Instead, he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the wadi and put them in the pouch in his shepherd's bag. Then, with a sling in his hand, he approached the Philistine. Okay, so you can imagine David, little kid, in this armor, and Saul is trying to make him like the Philistine. He's trying to give him armor. He's trying to give him a sword. He's trying to make him look more impressive than he actually is. But that's not God's way. That's not the way God wanted it. The Philistine came closer and closer to David with a shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he despised him because he was just a youth, healthy and handsome. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks?" That's one of the funniest lines I think I've ever heard. Because you can see this big guy just going, "Whoa, you think I am a dog that you're coming at me with a stick? You want to play fetch or something?" Then he cursed David by his gods. "Come here," the Philistine called to David, "and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts." Here's little old David. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defiled him. Today the Lord will hand you over to me. Today I will strike you down, remove your head, and give the corpses of the Philistine camp to the birds of the sky and the wild creatures of the earth. Then all the world will know that Israel has a God, and this whole assembly will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves. For the battle is the Lord's. He will hand you over to us." Now here's one of the great lines. When the Philistines started forward to attack him, David ran quickly to the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag, took out a stone, slung it, and hit the Philistine on his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. Okay, and that word, face down, the original word that is used all over the Bible. And it means to fall forward. And one of the positions that we worship God is falling forward. So basically, God's saying, "You don't want to worship me? Okay." And then he put him in a position. So David ran quickly. He was not afraid because he knew that God was waiting on the other side. David defeated the Philistine with a sling and a stone. David overpowered the Philistine and killed him without having a sword. David ran and stood over him. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it up from its sheath, and used it to kill him. Then he cut off his head. When the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they fled. Okay, long story. David was trying to climb up the tunnel. He came across some obstacles that were in front of him. He knew where he had to go. He knew God's will. And when he came to the line and he saw all these people who were refusing to do anything for God, because that was what he was saying. David came up to him and said, "Are you guys not going to do anything about this guy who's saying these things against my God, our God?" And they went and hid. They retreated. Even Saul. David confronted him. And in his own way, he said, "Are you not going to do anything about this?" How many times do we see things that we know that God would want us to do, but we don't do anything about it? Somebody else will do it. I'm afraid. Somebody else can go do it. But David took the lead because he knew that God would be with him. So I can't stand 3-point sermons. That's just not my nature, but I have a 3-point sermon tonight. Okay? The first is to uphold God's reputation. Okay? The first thing in this story is David saw that God's reputation was at stake. And he wanted to stand up for God's reputation. So he was willing to go out on the front lines and fight for God's reputation. The second thing is he trusted God to lead him and guide him and get him through what God had told him he would be going through. Because he was anointed as king. Even though it was quiet and Samuel didn't tell anybody, he was anointed as the king. And he knew that he had big shoes to fill. Not that they were being filled appropriately at that point, but the position of king, the whole purpose of the position of king was to point people to God. Not to fight battles and run the politics. The whole position of king was to remind them, you asked for somebody to lead you, and I'm giving you somebody who's going to lead you. And then Saul did not do what he was supposed to do. But David, he's being set up to be that leader after God's heart. Yeah, he messes up a lot too, but he's that one that God chose. The third thing, we have to balance our faith in God and our trust in God with our own skills. Sometimes we think, oh, we're going to do this. We're going to be the one that donates a whole bunch of money. We're going to be the ones to do this. Remember, when we first started, Samuel went to Saul, but Saul was up building a monument to himself. He was not doing it for God. He was doing it for himself. So his balance was off. He was leaning toward the side of the world and not the side of God. So back with Hannah. She wanted a child. She prayed for a child. When she came to the temple every year, she prayed for a child. Her husband kind of threw some backhanded comments at her, like, am I not as good as a child? But she felt inadequate because she didn't have a child. She knew that her child would have a purpose. Her husband's second wife also threw jabs at her. You know, she was saying, well, you know, you can't have a child, but I can. And she was constantly looking at the outside, not what God had planned for her. And the same thing when Samuel approached David's family, Jesse's family. They all thought one of these 7 boys is going to be the one that God chooses. But it wasn't. It was the last one picked, the one that they didn't even consider. But all of these people that have their focus is on God, not on the world. When the armies when they saw the Philistine Goliath, they were afraid because they knew that armor, weapons meant power. But what they failed to remember was that God was behind them. And God was the one that brought them from Egypt, brought them through all of the things that they had been through. God was the same God who brought David up against lions, bears, maybe tigers, I don't know. Lions, tigers, and bears, oh my, I don't know. But in our lives, we have lions and bears. We have things that God has led us through that will help us down the road. When we face these challenges, we look up the tunnel and we say, okay, now what in my life has led me to believe that I can do this? And she looks up, and Emily sees me up there, and she says, I trust that guy because he pulled me out of the mud. He pulled me out of the pool when I felt like I was drowning. All of these things. Oh, and the most important thing, he got the spider out of the pool. Okay? So, all of these things, they're markers from our past to help us in the future. Because if we're doing God's will, then he will help us. He will lead us and guide us. So I want us to think about that tonight. What are some of our lions and our bears? What are the things that over the years God has led us through? And how can we use that? How can we remember that? How can we rethink? And maybe it's something like Pastor was talking about this morning. Maybe we need to subtract something. Okay? So David had all this armor from Saul, but that wasn't helpful. It was slowing him down. It didn't fit him right. It was the world. So he got rid of it. He subtracted it. And he added something that the Philistines didn't have. He added the power of God. And so the result, dead Goliath. So the rest of the whole book of 1 Samuel is all about Saul chasing David. Okay, it goes on and on and on, and it continues over into Kings, and it's a great story. I love the whole narrative of just being able to sit down and read the whole story straight through. And I kind of rushed through it tonight, but I hope you understand that it's all one big story. And tonight we looked at David, and even though he messed up a lot, he was looking up that tunnel, and he always kept his eyes on God until he didn't. And when he didn't, that's the times he fell. He slid back down the tunnel. And then he realized it. He had his little crying moments in the Psalms. And then he looked back up at the tunnel and said, Father, forgive me. Help me back up. So David's a pretty cool guy. I like him. All right. So let's close in prayer. We're almost there. Man. All right. So let's close and ask God to be with us as we leave. Heavenly Father, God, it's awesome to just read your word and study it. And Lord, just to soak it in and pull things together and give it to your people. God, I love being able to do that. And God, I'd ask that you be with everyone that's here tonight and everyone that's online. And Lord, just help them to see all the lions and the bears that are in their lives, and that they can remember and rethink about their situation and remember, what has God brought me through before, and how can he help me today? Lord, be with us as we depart from this place, and help us to be your body in the world. In your name we pray. Amen.